everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Sophie, and this channel is chronicling my journey of living my best life with multiple chronic health conditions. Today we are going to go over the muscle biopsy results. We are not going to talk about interpretation. I go to Philadelphia tomorrow on Wednesday, June 24th, which is probably when I will schedule this video to go up and see what they have to say about the results. So this is just sort of verbatim what the report said, not reading into it, not diagnosing, none of that. Just what did they find? As a refresher, I had a muscle biopsy done to look for possible mitochondrial disease back on April 17th of this year, and I have been patiently or impatiently waiting for the results. I did message Philly or CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as I will refer to them, on Friday the 19th, just sort of asking them, hey, I don't see the results. Are the results going to be back in time for my appointment on Wednesday, because I'm not driving there if the results aren't there. Then yesterday, on Monday the 22nd, they did respond saying, hey, we have all your results, sort of here they are. So let's discuss them. I'm going to discuss them in reference to the different tests that were done. So there were technically 6 different tests, so we're going to go over 6 different results. Let me line my computer up a little differently. Okay, the first test was just light microscopy, just sort of normal looking under the microscope and doing specific stains looking at the mitochondria. Also of note, I'm not going to talk about things that were normal. So everything I'm going to talk about is abnormal, and if I don't mention it, it was normal. I will try to remember some of the things that were normal just so you get an idea of what was normal about it versus what was abnormal. Anyway, back to the light microscopy. It showed skeletal muscle with mild variation in fiber size and shape. One stain showed a rare same-type fiber grouping. Another stain showed very rare same-type fiber grouping. Inflammatory markers highlight very rare, some inflammatory cells. And then another test, another way of looking at it, found scattered macrophages, which are part of the immune system. So all of that was under normal microscope and staining. Things that were normal, there were no like ragged red fibers, which you can see in mitochondrial sieve. I believe it's called like SDH staining was normal. The Trimari training was normal. The Cox staining was normal. All of that stuff was normal, which I was expecting because I don't have normally presenting mitochondrial disease, and those stains are normally abnormal in normally presenting mitochondrial disease in children. So that didn't surprise me at all. Moving on to gene sequencing and deletion analysis. So what this does is it looks at the mitochondrial DNA and whether everything is sort of in sequence and whether there's any deletions. So deletions is if you think of a DNA as an alphabet, a deletion would be if you're missing some of the alphabet. So it looks at that and then it reports it as a level of heteroplasmy, which is just talking about how much of the mitochondria this affects. Okay, so the mitochondrial genome sequencing and deletion analysis found multiple large-scale mitochondrial DNA deletions at heteroplasmy level less than 10%. In English, that means there were multiple different parts of the alphabet that were missing, deleted, but in less than 10% of the mitochondria they looked at. So not a lot of mitochondria were affected, but there were multiple deletions sort of all over the place in the mitochondria. Okay? Third test. We're going to leave the third test till last. Third test we'll talk about is the mitochondrial DNA analysis, which is depletion. So we talked about deletion, now we're going to talk about depletion. Depletion is if you just don't have enough mitochondrial DNA. I, on the other hand, had more mitochondrial DNA than would be expected. I had 125.1% expected mitochondrial DNA, and the report stated that it was considered proliferation. So the opposite of deletion, sort of, it was proliferation. Now let's go to the enzyme activity, which talks about each specific complex in the electron transport chain, except 5. Apparently we can't measure 5. I don't know why. I spent 5.5 hours or so looking all this stuff up yesterday to just understand what it meant at the basic level. So bear with me. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on YouTube. I'm just doing my best. So I'll run through a quick absolute values and their standard deviations, but then I'll talk more about normalized values because that's really what is more looked at. So we're going to talk about complex 1, 2, 3, 2 and 3, 4, and citrate synthase. On the latter, citrate synthase is an enzyme that helps sort of get the electron transport chain started. At least that's my understanding of it. So it's not a direct measure of how much mitochondria you have or anything like that. It's an enzyme. So keep that in mind for later on. So complex 1, I had 42% of expected, or 2.3 standard deviations below the mean. Complex 2 was 63%, or negative 1.2 standard deviations below the mean. Complex 3 was 77%, or negative 0.1%, so basically completely normal. Complex 2 and 3 was 73%, which was 0.6 below the mean, which is basically normal. Complex 4 was 62%, which was 0.9 standard deviations below the mean. And then citrate synthase, which is that enzyme I talked about a few seconds ago, was 59%, or negative 1.9 standard deviations below the mean. Now, the report that looked at the ECT analysis, the complexes that we're talking about now, is not the same report, the same lab that looked at the mitochondrial content, the depletion, which I have the opposite of. I have proliferation. So proliferation, it was stated, is normally compensatory. Your mitochondria is producing multiple copies of DNA to make up for something. The citrate synthase report, since it was a different lab without access to the proliferation finding, said that citrate synthase is often found with sort of like deconditioning. But to me, those two don't go together very well. How can you have a proliferation of mitochondrial DNA but less enzyme that you expect to find in mitochondria? So speaking purely based on the muscle biopsy results, that is curious. And then bringing in past lab results, my cardiopulmonary exercise test, or my CPET, has consistently shown I'm able to hit 85+% of the expected workload, despite my VO2 max and anaerobic threshold progressively getting worse. So that would not appear to be detraining. So all of that stuff I will bring up tomorrow, and we'll report back on the video this weekend. But that's sort of the absolute values that we went over. They often normalize the absolute values to citrate synthase because the thought is if you have low or high citrate synthase, it would make sense to have low or high complex numbers. So they normalize it to citrate synthase because the latter is used as sort of a surrogate marker for mitochondrial number. So complex 1, when normalized to citrate synthase, was still pretty abnormal at negative 1.7 standard deviations below the mean. The rest of the complexes basically normalized 0.1 below, 0.3 above, 0, and 0.8 below. So normalized to citrate synthase, my complex 1 is still pretty low. They also normalize it to complex 2. I couldn't really find a reason for this, but it was basically more of the same. My complex 1 was still pretty abnormal at negative 1.8 standard deviations below the mean, whereas the rest were sort of normal, 0.3 to negative 0.8. So that was really interesting, especially with the proliferation. I have a feeling we're going to talk about a lot tomorrow at CHOP with the two tests and sort of what they mean when they happen together, because it's just interesting. Then the last two tests, test number 5 was BNP-PAGE, which is a test looking at do the complexes assemble normally. So you have all these pieces and parts you need to make the complexes, do the pieces and parts to go together normally. For me, yes, they do. My BNP-PAGE was the only test that came back normal. The last test was one of the first tests I got back, was CoQ10, and my CoQ10 was elevated. Normal is 155 to 411. Mine was slightly elevated at 442. This is not diagnostic. I do supplement with CoQ10, but had stopped prior to the muscle biopsy. So tomorrow I will just be asking, hey, is this leftover from supplementation, or is this CoQ10 elevated because it's not being used because of possibly complex 1 being decreased? That was a lot. It was, like I said, I spent 5.5 hours to be able to speak to those results, but I go to CHOP tomorrow. Well, today, when you're seeing this will be uploaded for June 24th. I am going to CHOP on June 24th. I will plan a video for sometime this weekend. I don't believe I have anything planned this weekend. Goodness, I hope not. I do not. So I will try to plan a video for Saturday or Sunday. That is the plan. I am driving to Philly, so don't hold me to that. I will get the video out as soon as possible. I apologize that this is a rather long video, but I was not expecting to have so many abnormal results, even if none of them were diagnostic. I was not expecting basically everything to be abnormal in some way that was not on my bingo card, if you will. Anyway, again, apologies for the video being so long. I appreciate it if you made it to the end. And as always, I hope you are having a wonderful day when you are seeing this, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.